Marjani had once lived a life of warmth and comfort, cherished by her noble father in the heart of Banjure. But fate had a cruel way of twisting dreams into nightmares. One night, without warning, her father vanished, leaving behind only whispers of dark magic and unanswered questions. His absence turned her world cold, and in its place, her stepmother, Zamira, rose like a shadow, spreading cruelty in every corner of the house. Zamira wasted no time showing her true nature. The moment Marjani lost her father, she lost her freedom as well. She was stripped of her fine dresses, forced into rags, and made to serve in her own home like a common servant. The grand halls that once echoed with her laughter now carried only the sounds of her exhaustion, the endless scrubbing of floors, the clattering of dishes, the muffled cries she dared not let anyone hear. Yet even in the darkness, Marjani refused to break. Her body may have been shackled by Zamira's cruelty, but her spirit remained untamed. She would not let this be her fate. Each night, as she lay on the cold stone floor, she dreamed of the day she would be free, of a world beyond the prison Zamira had built for her. What she did not know was that her destiny was already unfolding in ways she could never imagine. The night was thick with fog, curling like ghostly fingers through the twisted alleys of Banjure. Zamira moved swiftly, her cloak pulled tight around her, her heart pounding with anticipation. The letter had arrived at midnight, an invitation scrawled in blood, summoning her to the edge of the forbidden forest. She knew who had sent it. The rumors of vampires lurking in the shadows were not just myths. They were a reality she was willing to embrace. Greed burned inside her like a fever. She had spent years watching her beauty fade, her power slip through her fingers, while Marjani, despite her suffering, remained untouched by time, growing into a striking young woman. Zamira despised her. That girl, with her quiet strength, her defiant gaze, she was a threat, a reminder of everything Zamira had lost. But tonight, that would change. Tonight, she would trade away the last obstacle in her path. The air grew colder as she reached the clearing. A figure stood waiting, tall and motionless, his crimson eyes gleaming like embers in the dark. Lord Varric, a high-ranking vampire, a creature of nightmares. Yet to Zamira, he was an opportunity. You seek power. His voice was smooth, hypnotic, curling around her like silk. You seek beauty, and you have something we want. She knew there was no turning back. With a twisted smile, she spoke the words that sealed Marjani's fate. Take the girl, do what you will. In return, I want eternal youth, endless wealth. Varric stepped forward, amused. A simple trade, the blood of the innocent for vanity. He lifted a single clawed finger, drawing it across his palm. Dark blood dripped onto the earth, sizzling against the cold ground. It is done. That night, Marjani's world shattered. The door to her tiny room burst open. Before she could scream, rough hands grabbed her, yanking her from her makeshift bed of straw. A cloth was forced over her mouth, muffling her cries. The air grew thick with the scent of something unnatural, something wrong. Through blurred vision, she saw the silhouette of her stepmother standing at the doorway, watching, arms crossed. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. Zamira said nothing as Marjani was dragged away. The carriage waiting outside was unlike any she had ever seen. The horses were not horses at all, but creatures with hollow eyes and skins stretched too tight over their bones. The coach itself gleamed under the pale moonlight, black as obsidian, its doors adorned with silver carvings that pulsed as if alive. Marjani struggled, kicking, clawing, but the grip on her was iron. She was thrown inside, the door slamming shut behind her. The wheels groaned as the carriage lurched forward, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. Through the small barred window, she caught one last glimpse of Zamira, standing at the doorstep of their grand home, lifting a small vial of crimson liquid to her lips. The stepmother she had once feared now looked young again, her face glowing with unnatural beauty. The deal was complete, and Marjani, she was nothing more than a sold soul, disappearing into the night, into the heart of the forbidden lands, where no human ever returned. Darkness surrounded Marjani as she drifted between consciousness and oblivion. The last thing she remembered was the icy grip of the creatures who had taken her, the eerie creak of the carriage wheels, and the fading image of Zamira sipping from a vial, sealing her betrayal. Then nothing. Her body ached as she stirred, her senses slowly returning. Cold stone pressed against her skin, and the air carried a strange scent, ancient, metallic, almost like blood yet something far deeper. She forced her eyes open, and the sight before her sent a shiver down her spine. She was in a grand hall, unlike anything she had ever seen. Towering black columns stretched toward a ceiling veiled in swirling mist. The walls were carved with strange symbols that pulsed faintly, as if they were alive. Chandeliers of twisted bone hung overhead, their crimson flames casting eerie shadows across the vast chamber. And then there were the eyes, dozens of glowing eyes watching her from every corner, unblinking, inhuman. Marjani scrambled back, her breath quickening. They were vampires, pale figures draped in elegant yet tattered robes, their skins smooth as porcelain, their movements unnervingly silent. They stood still, staring at her, their expressions unreadable. She braced herself for the inevitable, the sharp pain of fangs sinking into her flesh, the life draining from her veins. But nothing happened. Instead, they whispered among themselves, their voices like the rustling of dead leaves. Some looked hesitant, others awed, but none approached her. She frowned, confusion overtaking her fear. Why weren't they attacking? Then the crowd parted, and he stepped forward. Zanefo. The moment he appeared, the air shifted. A force unseen yet powerful seemed to ripple through the chamber. He was unlike the others. Taller, his presence overwhelming. His hair was like shadows woven into silk, his eyes the color of burning embers. He carried himself with the confidence of a ruler, his very steps commanding the attention of every creature in the room. Marjani's breath caught as he came to a stop before her, his gaze piercing through her. It was not hunger she saw in his expression, not the primal need to feast upon her blood. No, this was something else entirely, a fascination, a recognition. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to her eye level. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep and rich, like the echo of thunder in the distance. "You," he murmured, as if tasting the word. "You are not what I expected." Marjani stiffened, unsure whether to speak, to run, to fight. Her body screamed at her to flee, but something inside her whispered to stay. The way they were looking at her, the way even the most powerful of them hesitated in her presence. There was something they knew that she did not. Zanefo reached out, his fingers stopping just before they touched her skin. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, and then he pulled his hand back. He turned to the others, his voice ringing through the hall. "She is not to be harmed." A murmur spread through the crowd, uncertainty and curiosity mixing in their glowing eyes. Marjani felt her pulse quicken. What was happening? Why were they acting as though she was something more than just a human girl thrown into their midst? Zanefo turned back to her, a slow, knowing smile curving his lips. "You are in my domain now, Marjani," he said, his voice carrying a weight she could not yet understand. "And it seems fate has plans for you." She had been sold as a sacrifice, but she was no victim, not anymore. A heavy silence filled the grand hall, thick with unspoken words and lingering tension. The vampires, once ready to tear Marjani apart, now stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on her with something almost like reverence. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her, suffocating yet strangely familiar, as if she had been here before, in another time, another life. Marjani's heartbeat pounded in her ears as Zanefo circled her slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. He moved with the grace of a predator, but there was no hunger in his expression, only curiosity, fascination, and something deeper she couldn't name. His presence was suffocating, yet she couldn't bring herself to look away. He stopped before her, reaching out once more, this time letting his fingers hover just above her skin. The moment he did, a sudden force rippled through the room. The torches lining the walls flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the dark stone. A gust of unseen wind swept through the hall, rustling cloaks, sending whispers of ancient power through the air. The vampires gasped in unison. Zanefo's eyes widened for the briefest moment before his lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. He let out a low chuckle, deep and satisfied, as if the universe had just confirmed something he had long suspected. "You are no mere girl," he murmured, his voice almost amused. Marjani stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Zanefo tilted his head, studying her, as if seeing through her very soul. "Your blood," he said. "It calls to us." The whispers among the vampires grew louder. Some looked at her with awe, others with disbelief, but none with fear. It was as if a hidden truth had just unraveled before them. Something sacred, something undeniable. "You feel it too, don't you?" Zanefo continued, his voice softer now, almost teasing. "That pull, that connection. Tell me, Marjani, Have you never wondered why you were different? Why you survived when others would have broken? Why, despite being raised among humans, you never truly belonged? Her breath hitched. She had felt it all her life, that strange emptiness, that lingering feeling that she was not meant for the life she had been forced into. But she had always thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, the wishful thinking of a girl desperate for an escape. Xanepho took a step closer, lowering his voice to a whisper only she could hear. You are one of us. Marjani's world tilted. Number. That wasn't possible. She was human, wasn't she? Xanepho turned to the gathered vampires, his voice echoing through the hall with undeniable authority. She carries the blood of the first queen, he declared. The last descendant of our ancient ruler. Our lost queen has returned. The moment the words left his lips, the entire chamber fell to their knees. Marjani's breath caught as she watched them bow, their heads lowered in submission, their hands pressed over their hearts in a gesture of absolute loyalty. The sight was overwhelming, unreal. These creatures, beings of the night feared by all, were kneeling before her. They whispered in unison, "The eternal queen." She staggered back, shaking her head. This isn't possible." Xanepho's smirk deepened. "And yet, here you stand." Marjani's hands clenched at her sides. She had spent her life being treated as nothing, thrown away like she was worthless. And now, in this strange, terrifying place, she was being told she was a queen, that she was meant to rule over the very creatures she had been raised to fear. A shiver ran through her as she looked at them, all of them, kneeling, waiting, believing. She had been sold as a sacrifice, but fate had given her a throne. Zamira draped herself in silk and jewels, admiring her reflection in the golden-framed mirror. Her once-aging skin now glowed with unnatural youth, her beauty restored beyond anything she had ever dreamed. She ran her fingers over her face, savoring the smoothness, the perfection. Wealth and power surrounded her, lavish feasts, servants at her beck and call, nobles who once dismissed her now groveling for her attention. She had won. She took a sip of crimson wine, relishing its taste, oblivious to the storm that loomed over her. The air outside had grown colder, the winds howling through the towering spires of her grand estate. The candles flickered uneasily, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, as if something unseen lurked just beyond her sight. She ignored it. She was untouchable now. Then, the knock came, slow, measured, echoing through the halls like a death knell. Her heart stuttered, a strange unease crawling up her spine. The doors swung open before she could command them to remain closed, and the torches dimmed as figures stepped into the room, cloaked in darkness. Their eyes gleamed like fire in the night. The vampires had come. Zamira's lips curled in annoyance. "You again," she scoffed, swirling her wine. "I gave you what you wanted. The girl. Why are you here?" Xanepho stepped forward, his presence making the very air grow heavy. His amusement was gone, replaced with something cold and merciless. "You truly believe you could deceive us?" Zamira laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "Deceive? I gave you a perfect offering, and in return, I got what I deserved. Our deal is done." Xanepho tilted his head slightly. "You misunderstand, Zamira. The girl was not a mere offering. She was never yours to sell." The glass in her hand trembled, though she gripped it tighter, refusing to show fear. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Xanepho stepped closer, his voice like ice. "Marjani was not just some human girl. She is of the ancient bloodline. She was meant to rule. And you," he leaned in, his breath ghosting over her ear, "are nothing but a greedy insect who thought she could control fate." Zamira's throat went dry. This couldn't be. That worthless girl. A ruler. It had to be a trick. She scoffed, though her voice wavered. "So what? She's yours now. What does it matter?" A cruel smile spread across Xanepho's lips. "It matters because you tried to sell a queen like she was cattle." Zamira's stomach twisted, her grip on the goblet unsteady. The air in the room shifted, the shadows creeping closer, pressing in. The other vampires moved around her, circling like wolves before the kill. She rose from her chair, stepping back. I'll give you whatever you want. More gold, more power. Name your price." Xanepho's gaze darkened. "You have nothing left to offer." The room erupted into chaos. Cold hands seized her arms, clawed fingers pressing into her flesh. Zamira screamed, thrashing, but the grip was unyielding. She had bargained with the monsters, but she had never imagined being on the other end of their hunger. Panic overtook her as they dragged her to the center of the room. The mirrors shattered, the torches snuffed out. plunging everything into near darkness. The vampires whispered around her, their voices like hissing winds, a chant in a language she did not understand. Then, the pain came. Fangs sank into her skin, slowly, deliberately, savoring her agony. They did not drain her quickly. No, they made it last. Each moment stretched into eternity, her veins set aflame, her body growing weaker, colder. She begged, she pleaded, she screamed for mercy. The vampires only laughed. Xenepho watched, his expression unreadable. "You wished for eternal youth," he murmured. "Now, you shall have it, but not as a queen." Her body crumpled to the floor, shaking violently as the transformation took hold. The warmth that had once filled her veins was gone, replaced by a hollow, endless hunger. The beauty she had once cherished twisted into something unnatural. Her reflection, when she finally forced herself to look, was monstrous. Her eyes sunken, her skin pallid, her lips eternally stained with the hunger for blood. Zemira had traded a girl for power, and in return, she had become a slave to the very creatures she had thought she could manipulate forever. The nights in the vampire castle were endless, stretching on like a dream Marjani couldn't wake up from. At first, she refused to believe what they told her, that she was one of them, that she carried the blood of an ancient queen. She had been raised as a human, suffered as a human, and now they expected her to rule over creatures that had haunted her childhood nightmares. It seemed impossible, but the change had already begun. At first, it was subtle. She no longer felt hunger for normal food. The exhaustion that had weighed her down for years vanished. Her senses sharpened. She could hear whispers from rooms far away, see the movement of shadows in complete darkness, feel the presence of others even when they were silent. The more she fought against it, the more it consumed her. One night she woke to the sound of her own breathing, or rather, the lack of it. Her heart no longer beat the way it used to. She wasn't human anymore. Xenepho watched her closely, studying her every reaction. He never forced her, never commanded her. He simply waited, knowing that sooner or later she would have to accept the truth, and when she did, there would be no going back. The first test of her power came unexpected. A rogue vampire, jealous of her sudden rise, attempted to strike her down in the dead of night. He was older, stronger, a seasoned warrior of the night. But Marjani didn't run. She didn't scream. She raised her hand, and without thinking, commanded him to stop, and he did. His body froze mid-attack, his fangs bared, eyes filled with rage and terror. Marjani didn't understand how she did it, only that it felt natural, like breathing, like blinking. With a single thought, she forced him to kneel before her. She could feel his fear, taste it in the air. The other vampires who had doubted her now looked at her with awe. She was no weak little girl. She was their queen. After that, there was no more doubt. Marjani trained relentlessly, pushing herself further, testing her limits. She was faster than any vampire in the castle, stronger than she ever imagined. She no longer flinched at the sight of blood or the darkness that lurked in every shadow. The fear that had once chained her had turned into something else, something powerful. She was no longer a victim. The past clawed at her mind, memories of pain and humiliation resurfacing with each passing night. Zemira's voice, filled with mockery, echoed in her ears. The bruises, the hunger, the loneliness. She remembered it all. Zemira had thrown her away like she was nothing, thinking she could be erased from existence. But Marjani was still here, and she wasn't just going to survive, she was going to make Zemira pay. Xenepho sensed the change in her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the way she carried herself now, not as a frightened girl, but as a ruler. He stood beside her, but he never interfered. This was her battle to fight. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of the castle, looking out at the endless dark woods that surrounded them, she whispered the words that sealed her fate. "I want to return to Banjure." The night air was still, the silence stretching between them. Xenepho studied her carefully. For what purpose? She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "To take what's mine." He smiled then, a slow, knowing smile. "Then it's time you wear your crown." The castle erupted in preparation. The vampires, once divided, now stood united under her command. The Eternal Queen had risen, and she was ready to claim her throne. The night was thick with silence as the gates of Banjure creaked open. A strange wind swept through the streets, carrying a chill that made the villagers shudder. They knew something was coming, something ancient, something powerful. And then they saw her. Marjani stepped through the gates, her presence sending a ripple of unease through the city. She no longer looked like the fragile girl who had been discarded. She walked with quiet authority, her long, dark cloak billowing behind her. Her eyes, once filled with pain and fear, now burned with an otherworldly glow. And behind her, like shadows stretching endlessly, marched the army of the night, vampires moving in perfect silence, their red eyes gleaming in the darkness. People scattered, whispering her name in fear and awe. Some fell to their knees, sensing the power that radiated from her. Others ran to hide, but there was no escaping what had come to claim Banjure. She had returned, not as a beggar, not as a victim, but as something far greater. Inside the grand estate where Zamira now lived in luxury, the air suddenly felt heavier. Candles flickered violently, and the once warm glow of the chandeliers seemed to dim. Zamira sat among her riches, draped in silk, her beauty untouched by time. She had everything she had ever wanted: wealth, power, eternal youth. But at that moment, as she heard the slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the halls, she felt something she had not felt in years: fear. She turned toward the grand doors, just as they swung open with a deafening crash. And there she was. The girl she had sold, the girl she had discarded as worthless, now stood before her, alive, powerful, unbreakable. Marjani stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Zamira's. There was no hatred in her eyes, no rage, only cold certainty. Zamira's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to command, to threaten, but the words died before they could escape her lips. "You look surprised," Marjani said, her voice smooth, almost amused. "Did you really think I would vanish?" Zamira's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her chair. "I gave you a fate worse than death," she whispered, her voice cracking. Marjani tilted her head slightly. "You tried." She took another step, and Zamira felt an invisible force press against her chest, forcing her back into her seat. Outside, the people of Banjure watched in silence as the vampire army spread through the streets. They did not destroy, they did not pillage, they simply stood, watching, waiting. The city was already theirs. The people just hadn't realized it yet. Zamira's carefully built world was crumbling, and she could see it in Marjani's eyes. This was not a visit. This was a reckoning. Zamira's heart pounded as she stared at the girl. No, the queen, standing before her. Marjani was no longer the helpless child she had once controlled. She was something greater, something terrifying. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally, as if bowing to their ruler. Zamira wanted to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. Marjani stepped closer, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. "I should thank you, Zamira," she said, her voice laced with something unreadable. "If not for you, I would have never known who I truly am." Zamira swallowed hard, her once perfect face twisting in panic. "Marjani, you what?" Marjani interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "Regret it? Do you expect mercy?" A cold smile touched her lips, but there was no warmth in it. "You sold me like an object, hoping to rid yourself of me. And look where it has brought you." Zamira's gaze flickered to the open doors. Outside, the city was no longer hers. The people of Banjure stood frozen in the streets, their eyes filled with fear and awe as vampires moved through the city, claiming it as their own. There was no war, no bloodshed, only silent submission. Banjure had fallen, not with a scream, but with a whisper. Desperation clawed at Zamira's chest. She had spent her entire life craving power, sacrificing everything for eternal beauty and wealth. But now, none of it mattered. What use was beauty when the reflection in the mirror no longer brought her joy? What use was wealth when it could not save her? "Please," she whispered, the word foreign on her tongue. "Spare me." Marjani's expression didn't change. "You never spared me," she replied softly. "You watched me suffer. You let me rot in the shadows of your greed. And now, I will return the favor." Zamira gasped as an unseen force gripped her, lifting her from the ground. Her body trembled as dark veins crawled up her skin, her beauty fading, her strength draining. She felt herself being pulled into the abyss, into a life of endless servitude. "No!" she screamed, struggling, clawing at the air. "Not this! Not eternal suffering." But Marjani was unmoved. "You wanted to be eternal, Zamira," she murmured. "Now you will be." Zamira's screams echoed through the halls as her body twisted, her soul bound in darkness. No longer a queen, no longer powerful, she was now a shadow, forever cursed to serve the very creatures she once sought to control. Marjani watched in silence as the last of Zamira's humanity faded away. There was no pleasure in her eyes, no joy in her vengeance. She had no need for cruelty. Justice had already been served. She turned and walked away, stepping out into the night where her people awaited her. Banjure was hers now, not through force, not through destruction, but through the inevitable truth that she had become something greater than them all. The humans feared her. The vampires worshipped her. She was the ruler of both worlds. And as she stood beneath the pale moonlight, she knew one thing for certain. Her reign had only just begun. The night air in Banjure had changed. It no longer carried the whispers of fear, no longer felt heavy with oppression. The city, once ruled by greed and betrayal, now stood under the reign of an eternal queen. Marjani sat on the throne that once belonged to those who looked down on her, her fingers resting lightly on the armrests, her presence alone enough to make even the strongest bow. She was no longer the helpless girl who had been sold for power. She was power, not the kind that crushed or consumed, but the kind that balanced the world between darkness and order. The humans feared her, but they also respected her. The vampires worshipped her, but they did not control her. Marjani was not just their ruler, she was their destiny. Zanefo stood beside her, ever watchful, a shadow at her side. He was the only one who did not kneel, the only one who met her gaze with unwavering loyalty. He had ruled for centuries, yet he had never seen a queen like this. Marjani was something new, something terrifying and beautiful at once. And despite his power, despite his wisdom, he knew one thing. She alone commanded the fate of this world. Far in the distance, hidden in the darkest corners of the castle, a pair of hollow eyes watched. Zamira, stripped of her beauty, her power, her very essence, was nothing but a shadow now. She did not speak, she did not cry. She only existed, trapped in the eternal torment she had brought upon herself. She had once thought she could control fate, twist destiny to her will. But in the end, she had only created the very force that had destroyed her. And Marjani knew it. She felt Zamira's presence in the darkness, but she did not acknowledge it. The past no longer mattered. Vengeance was done. Justice had been served. There was only the future now, a future where she ruled not with cruelty, but with strength. The city of Banjure would thrive under her reign. The balance between human and vampire would remain because she willed it so. And as the moon cast its silver glow over the kingdom, Marjani sat upon her throne, her eyes burning with the fire of eternity. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. You see, power is not just about ruling. It's about knowing when to show mercy and when to remind the world why you should never be underestimated. Marjani was forced into darkness, but she didn't let it consume her. She became something more. And maybe, just maybe, that's a lesson for all of us. So, what do you take from this story? That fate is cruel, that power corrupts, or that sometimes the ones we throw away are the ones who rise the highest? Think about it. And if you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Who knows, maybe there's another story waiting for you in the next video. Watch till the end, because in this world, the best secrets are always hidden in the last moments.